Up on a forsaken ridge in the Mississippi Delta, where the red dirt path faded away amongst the weeping willows, and the quiet began to weigh heavy like a mourning veil, a young pregnant freedwoman struggled to survive on her own in a dilapidated timber and mud cabin that could barely stand upright, devoid of kin, devoid of a partner, entirely forsaken, left behind seasons ago by the man who had sworn to provide for her. All that remained to her name was that humble dwelling deep in the woods, and the unborn child growing heavy within her womb. Folks across the sprawling cotton-growing settlements echoed the very same judgment. Ain't nobody capable of surviving out there all alone, yet she possessed no other refuge. Until one ordinary dawn, as the sun was still breaching the backs of the emerald bluffs, and the soil remained soaked with the midnight dew, an unfamiliar man appeared trudging up the muddy trail. He approached at a dragging pace, leading a pair of goats hitched to a hemp rope, bearing a field hoe over his shoulder like a soul hauling a destiny he has yet to fathom. And in that fleeting second, unbeknownst to her, the fabric of reality shifted forever that morning. In the Deep South, the silence carries an altogether different burden. It ain't akin to the quiet that settles over village squares once the wagon trains roll out and the dust clears. That transient, brittle sort of hush that evaporates at the slightest peal of a bell or a human holler. The silence of the Delta is infinitely more profound, unfathomably deep. It emanates from the primordial thickets untouched by any lumberjack's axe, from those towering pines that sometimes choke out the sun before it even hits high noon. It stems from the breeze rustling through the leaves of the cotton plants, a murmur that barely registers as a sound because it is so relentless, so eternal, that a person's mind simply stops noticing it. It echoes from the mournful, distant cooing of a mourning dove that always feels like it's resting beyond the next ridge, somewhere where the weeds sprout in untamed clusters and the creeks wash freezing cold over jagged rocks. And within that crumbling, dirt-chinked cabin, hidden amidst the verdant hills, the silence served as Cora's sole companion. That particular Monday, in the early fall of 1855, began much like any other. The morning sun had not quite claimed its absolute peak in the heavens. It was that specific early hour when the daylight feels lukewarm, faintly silvery, and the atmosphere still holds on to a lingering breath of midnight chill. Cora had risen at the crack of dawn, an everyday habit now, given her weary bones could no longer find comfortable rest. Her swollen belly dragged her down, her spine ached fiercely, and it felt as though the infant stirred earlier with each passing sunrise, as if it were just as desperate to draw its first breath as she was to finally deliver it. Her given name was Cora Washington. She was 24 years of age, carrying a child for 7 months and a fortnight. The emancipation papers she kept folded tight inside her bodice had been signed 2 years prior by the late planter, Master Elijah Washington, owner of the vast estate where her mother had been held in bondage. The surname Washington she had adopted out of mere habit, as was customary for so many freed folk. It wasn't a title bestowed upon her with any shred of affection, merely the designation of her final deceased master, which she bore much like a soldier, carries the thick scar of a wound that has scabbed over, but never truly vanished. Her liberation was legally binding. The documents were real. Yet freedom devoid of acreage, devoid of coin, lacking kin and lacking a husband, in the Mississippi Delta of 1855, was only worth as much as the parchment holding up against a heavy downpour. The structure she inhabited wasn't a proper home. It was more like the decaying corpse of a house. The mud-daubed walls were fractured in numerous places, not merely hairline fractures, but gaping crevices wide enough to swallow a whole hand. The clay would bake dry, shrink, and then clumsily attempt to swell back together when the torrential rains came, forming a cracked mosaic that resembled the cartography of some forsaken wasteland. The sagging roof, made of weather-beaten wooden shingles, boasted gaping holes that welcomed not just the pouring storms, but frequently the freezing midnight drafts that forced Cora to clutch her ragged quilts tighter against her womb, just to keep the fragile life inside her warm. Whenever a storm broke, and a storm was virtually a sworn promise between late fall and early spring in that sweltering, damp region, leaks would instantly sprout in no fewer than 5 distinct spots. Cora had taken to positioning tin basins and a rusted iron pot beneath those drips to harvest the runoff. In the dead of night, The relentless rhythm of those drops, plink, 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 acted as a dreadful metronome, keeping her eyes wide open as she counted the watery strikes while praying for a slumber that flatly refused to arrive. The battered oak door shrieked violently any time a stiff gust struck it. It was a piercing, grating wail that shuddered through the entirety of the tiny shack's frame. Cora had attempted to smear bacon grease over the rusty iron hinges a few weeks back, but the oppressive heat baked it away in no time, and the screaming hinges returned more obnoxious than before. Nevertheless, it was the sum total of her worldly possessions, and at that specific juncture in her existence, it remained the sole patch of earth where no living soul possessed the legal authority to chase her off. She had settled there a half-year prior. It wasn't a destination she had actively sought out. Truth be told, she hadn't actively chosen a single thing during that entire dark chapter of her life. Events had merely crashed into her, one right after another, akin to boulders tumbling down a ravine after the first heavy thunderstorm. She had arrived carrying only a meager bundle of garments, a faded swatch of calico fabric, a head wrap her mama had bequeathed her before being sold down the river, a few patched-up dresses, and a secret swelling rapidly inside her belly. A secret that was no longer hidden from anyone, for her growing form betrayed everything she desperately sought to conceal. The child's father had already fled. He went by the name of young Master Charles. He was the eldest heir of the wealthy planter, Colonel Beauregard, and had arrived in the Delta during a time when the region was enjoying a massive economic boom built entirely upon the backs of enslaved African men and women, relying on their unpaid sweat to plant, pick and bale the cotton that fueled the bustling textile markets up north. He was the privileged son of the esteemed Colonel Beauregard, a man of 42 years, possessing the sort of handsome, unblemished features typical of a plantation owner's offspring, whose life has never demanded a drop of actual hardship. He had ventured to that specific territory merely to oversee his father's vast financial interests during the harvest season, and the moment he laid eyes upon Cora, who at that time was 23 with a face still gentle, still radiating a vibrant grace that relentless sorrow had not yet entirely stripped away, he made up his mind that he simply must have her. Those initial weeks felt akin to a beautiful fantasy that Cora didn't yet realize was a cruel mirage. He would escort her on quiet strolls along the riverbanks just as the evening dew settled. He spoke honeyed words. He swore he adored her, swore he intended to make their union proper, claiming his powerful father, the Colonel, had guaranteed them a modest parcel of acreage to build their lives upon. He insisted her whole world was about to transform, that she would never again have to fret over flimsy freedom papers or the harsh judging glares of white society. Cora swallowed every lie. Why on earth wouldn't she? Not a single soul in her entire life had ever woven such elaborate falsehoods. Her own mama had been painfully, brutally honest. Her daddy, who had perished from exhaustion when she was barely 10, had been a stoic man of incredibly few words, yet possessed unshakable integrity. She simply lacked the worldly experience to harbor suspicion. Thus she yielded her entire heart to young Master Charles, and ultimately found herself with child. His sweet oaths survived only a few short weeks after the news broke. Initially, the excuses began to pile up. He was purportedly swamped with overseeing the immense cotton harvest. Subsequently, the gaps between their clandestine meetings grew wider and wider. Then, the prolonged, agonizing silences set in. Then came the endless days devoid of any word, which bled into weeks and finally into hollow months. Until the tragic afternoon, Cora recognized that the naked truth was far less complicated than any elaborate excuse she had been conjuring up to soothe her own breaking heart. He had packed his trunks and departed for Charleston, and he was never, ever coming back. Her mother had been auctioned away when Cora was merely 15. Her extended bloodline was scattered to the winds across the sprawling plantations, enslaved men and women who possessed neither the freedom to travel nor a roof of their own to offer. Not a single person stepped forward to lend a hand. Nobody extended so much as a brief word of solace that went beyond a fleeting, pitying sigh, a sigh entirely too realistic to offer any genuine comfort. That was when Cora caught rumors of an abandoned shack sitting atop a lonely ridge, swallowed by the wilderness. a forgotten dwelling that had once belonged to an elderly, reclusive couple who had long since passed, leaving the property to kin who had established themselves far away in bustling cities. A rotting structure that nobody in their right mind desired, a place she could claim, not with legal deeds, not officially, but in pure, desperate practice. She had trekked all the way up there, clutching her pitiful cloth bundle of garments, pushed open a door lacking any lock, and stepped into the gloomy space that would serve as her sanctuary for the harrowing months ahead. That is exactly how she began her solitary existence there, burying a few rows of sweet potatoes behind the cabin in a small clearing that had previously served as a vegetable patch. The sweet potatoes were a hardy crop. They demanded very little, and she possessed the ancestral knowledge to tend them because her grandmother used to maintain a tiny garden plot when Cora was a little girl. She hauled her drinking water from a winding creek located several dozen yards down the slope, trudging barefoot along a rough trail she had beaten down through the brush with her own weary footsteps, lugging heavy wooden pails that bit cruelly into her shoulders and blistered her palms, all the while doing her best to ignore the agonizing spasms in her lower back that intensified with every passing week. Yet, what she remained completely oblivious to was the fact that within that very same delta, during that very same parched season of September, there existed a man who was similarly striving to vanish from the face of the earth. A man who had been violently stripped of every single thing that gave him a reason to draw breath, and who was currently trudging up the red mud path, hauling 2 goats and a field hoe, driven not by any flicker of hope, but simply because the physical shell continues to march long after the human spirit has entirely flatlined. Mr. Thomas Montgomery was exactly 42 years old. He was the master of a moderately sized cotton holding, acres of white gold, a modest herd of cattle, and a contingent of enslaved men and women whom he governed with a considerably lighter and fairer hand than the vast majority of ruthless planters in that harsh territory, or so it was claimed by those acquainted with him. He was not inherently a wicked man, never had been. He was, however, a completely shattered one. His beloved wife, Miss Eleanor, had succumbed to cholera 18 months prior, during a horrific 3-day window that felt to Thomas Montgomery not like a mere 3 days, but rather an entire agonizing eternity compacted into 72 hours of unadulterated suffering. He had gripped her feverish hand right up until the final shallow breath. He had whispered desperate promises he possessed no worldly power to keep. And when the end finally came, he had remained paralyzed in a chair beside her lifeless form for hours on end, entirely incapable of summoning the house servants to wash the body, incapable of doing a single thing other than staring blankly at the face he had cherished deeply for 18 years, a face that was now reduced to total, terrifying emptiness. The plantation's operations marched onward. The enslaved field hands continued toting their sacks through the cotton rows. The crops continued to sprout. The harsh overseer kept barking his orders, but Mr. Thomas Montgomery had essentially ceased to exist. He had turned sharply to the whiskey bottle. He had abandoned the ledgers. He had surrendered critical financial choices to a shrewd cotton broker up in Memphis, who eagerly capitalized on the grieving widower's apathy to orchestrate underhanded deals that were far from honorable. And eventually, a grim morning arrived when Mr. Thomas realized his legacy was being cannibalized by his own profound neglect, and the singular method to halt that tragic decay was for him to physically evaporate before the ruination was absolute. Therefore, on a crisp September dawn, without uttering a syllable to a living soul about his destination, without penning a single line of farewell to his daughter Clara, who was currently receiving a proper education at a strict boarding school in Charleston, without any justification whatsoever, Mr. Thomas Montgomery had tethered 2 goats, grabbed a heavy hoe, and commenced a long march down the red clay trail toward a forgotten ridge where, according to a venerable enslaved elder named Uncle Silas, who knew every hidden inch of that county, there lay fertile loam, crystal clear water, and absolutely nobody around to bother a man. He was not journeying toward hope. He was journeying because the physical shell continues to march long after the human spirit has entirely flatlined. And then, an entirely unforeseen event transpired. Midway up the winding trail, just as the sun struck its agonizing zenith, and the baking heat of the clay radiated upward past their ankles, Mr. Thomas Montgomery laid eyes upon a woman. She was perched atop a large stone bordering the path, cradling an empty clay basin in her lap, quite evidently taking a momentary rest on her trek down to the creek. She was heavily with child. Her stomach was massive and pronounced beneath her faded, threadbare calico skirt. Her feet were bare and crusted with the distinctive red mud, and her gaze was fixed on the dirt with that particular hollow expression worn only by those who have long since stopped asking the universe questions, because the universe never bothered to provide any answers. Mr. Thomas halted his steps. The two goats similarly froze, almost as if the dumb beasts recognized that this exact fraction of time was wholly distinct from every other moment of that blistering morning. He stood there, staring intently at the pregnant woman for a span that stretched out much longer than it actually was. She eventually lifted her chin and met his stare without a shred of terror, yet equally without a shred of welcome. It was the hardened glare of a survivor who possessed absolutely nothing left to lose, and consequently no longer bothered with pleasant pretenses. "Begging your pardon, ma'am, but the gentleman at the estate yonder mentioned there might be fresh water further up this track," Mr. Thomas murmured, gesturing vaguely back over his shoulder toward the direction he had traveled. "I'm the only lady of any house around these parts," Cora retorted flatly. "And yes, there's water. You just keep following this rut, take a left at the twisted old oak tree, and the creek's right there." He gave a slow nod. She shifted her eyes toward the livestock. "Those belong to you?" she inquired. "They do," he replied. "They got names?" "No," he stated softly, following a silence that felt entirely too heavy for such a mundane question. Cora studied the goats for a few seconds longer. "Well then, I reckon I'll call this one Hope and I'll call that one Memory," she declared, "'cause I figure that's exactly what they represent to a man like you, even if you ain't quite figured it out yourself yet." Mr. Thomas Montgomery offered no retort. Yet, crucially, he did not resume his march either. That seemingly minor choice to remain rooted to that clay path for a handful of extra minutes would spark a chain of consequences he wouldn't fully comprehend until much later. What unfolded next happened in a slow, creeping manner, precisely the way all genuine things tend to develop. He trudged down to the creek, filled his canteens, and upon his return journey, he passed directly in front of Cora's dilapidated shack. She was situated outside, desperately attempting to patch a section of the rotting roof that had caved in during the heavy squalls of the prior week. She was balancing precariously atop an unsteady wooden crate, 7 months along in her pregnancy, caught in a balancing act that was visibly hazardous. Mr. Thomas calmly tied Hope and Memory to a sturdy sapling, stepped right up onto her makeshift ladder without uttering a word of permission or explanation, and simply nudged her aside with a firm yet deeply respectful gentleness. It wasn't an invasion of her space, but rather a practical intervention, and he immediately set to repairing the shingles with the practiced ease of a man who had spent a lifetime maintaining sprawling agricultural estates. Cora remained on the ground, watching him work. She didn't spit out a quick, "Thank you." She waited patiently until he climbed down. Only then did she speak. "You've got a knack for mending things." "I've patched up my fair share in this life," he replied, brushing the splinters from his palms as he descended. He hesitated. "Considerably less than I've managed to break," he added in a hushed, gravelly whisper, sounding as though he were confessing it solely to the wind. Cora pretended the words hadn't reached her ears, but they had. In the days that immediately followed, a subtle, unannounced shift took root on that ridge. Mr. Thomas had located a flat patch of soil at the far crest of the hill, situated on the opposite side of Cora's shack, and had commenced erecting a rudimentary lean-to for his own shelter. Not uncomfortably close, distant enough to ensure that no gossiping tongue could accuse them of any untoward impropriety, yet situated closely enough that, should she cry out in the dark, he would undoubtedly hear it. This, too, was a boundary that neither party had ever vocalized or negotiated. It was merely the organic fashion in which their coexistence arranged itself, almost as if an ancient, unspoken law of nature was silently directing their mutual footsteps. Come daybreak, he would emerge bearing chopped firewood, She would emerge bearing freshly dug sweet potatoes from her modest garden plot. They prepared their meals sometimes in total isolation, and other times engulfed in a mutual quietude that didn't bristle with awkwardness, though it hadn't yet blossomed into genuine trust. The goats, Hope and Memory, would wander back and forth between the two camps, acting as if they were equally bewildered as to whose jurisdiction they truly fell under. Fresh goat's milk served as the very first formal olive branch Mr. Thomas extended. A brimming tin cup of it, deposited stealthily on the dirt right beside Cora's threshold every single morning, long before the sun or the woman had fully risen. She never once breathed a word acknowledging the gesture, but the cup was always drained dry. And then came a morning when he awoke to discover a thick slice of baked sweet potato bread resting neatly on a leaf just outside his own crude lean-to. No accompanying note, no verbal justification, just the humble offering of sustenance. That unspoken trade represented the initial fragile sprout of mutual faith, minuscule, akin to a mustard seed, but it was, undoubtedly, a seed. Cora had not volunteered her tragic history immediately. Folks burdened by deep shame rarely speak of it quickly, and a profound shame definitely lingered there. Not the variety of shame she rightfully earned, but the toxic variety that a cruel society unjustly heaps upon the shoulders of women who have been manipulated and left to pay the ultimate price alone. She had been thoroughly duped by young Master Charles. She had surrendered her most sacred possession, her absolute trust, and had reaped in return nothing but a swollen belly and a suffocating abandonment that stung far worse than a lash. None of this was Cora's sin, yet society dictates that guilt need not be earned to crush the spirit of a colored woman. Mr. Thomas equally had kept his harrowing past locked away tight. Men lugging around the crippling weight of profound grief rarely bare their souls to strangers. And his grief was a heavy, suffocating shroud, the kind that seeps deep into the marrow, the kind that doesn't merely fade with the flipping of calendar pages, but demands a grueling, deliberate choice to keep on breathing in spite of the agony, a choice as exhausting as ploughing a stubborn field full of rocks. It happened on a blustery evening that the truth finally forced its way out of their chests. A steady, warm drizzle was falling, one of those sudden southern squalls that wash over the delta during the autumn shift, and the pair had inevitably sought refuge beneath the narrow overhang of Cora's porch, seeing as it was the sole patch of dependably dry ground for miles, courtesy of the sturdy repairs he had executed weeks prior. Perched upon separate wooden crates, staring blankly into the curtain of fine rain, inhaling the rich, earthy perfume of the wet red mud, one of them, neither could recall later who actually broke the seal, uttered a raw, unfiltered truth. And the other soul immediately reciprocated with an equally raw truth, and that quiet rhythm persisted until the storm clouds finally broke, by which point they had exchanged vastly more than mere syllables. She poured out the tale of young Master Charles, the honeyed vows and the cowardly, ghostly exit that followed. She spoke of the fragile freedom papers tucked against her breast, a legally binding shield that truthfully offered no genuine armor against the world's cruelties. She recounted the memory of her mama being dragged away to the auction block when she was barely 15. She spoke of her siblings, scattered like chaff across the brutal plantations, incapable of throwing her a lifeline because they were bound in iron chains themselves. She described a specific brand of isolation that defied comparison, primarily because she had never actively elected to be a hermit. She was simply the leftover debris after everyone she loved had either fled or been forcibly stolen. In turn, he laid bare the history of Miss Eleanor, the glorious 18 years they had shared walking the same earth. He described the ferocious cholera outbreak that breached their doors on a Wednesday and mercilessly snuffed out his entire universe by Friday afternoon. He spoke of the suffocating aftermath, days that visually mimicked the days before, yet felt completely gutted on the inside, much like gazing at a grand antebellum mansion that appears pristine from the road, but is secretly choked with toxic smoke within. He confessed his abandonment of the sprawling estate because managing a profitable plantation without her at his side felt like a brutally hollow pantomime, and he spoke of his daughter Clara, trapped in a strict academy in Charleston, whom he had forsaken without a single word of comfort because, in that suffocating darkness, he found it utterly impossible to function as both a protective father and a fundamentally shattered man simultaneously. When Mr. Thomas Montgomery finally allowed his voice to trail off, a wholly different caliber of silence enveloped them. It wasn't the oppressive, ancient silence of the Delta wilderness. It was the sacred quiet between two battered human beings who had just genuinely witnessed one another's naked souls for the very first time. "With all due respect, Mr. Thomas," Cora murmured softly, her eyes tracking a raindrop on the dirt rather than meeting his gaze, "you didn't hike up this godforsaken ridge to lay down and die. You dragged yourself up here because there's a stubborn piece of your spirit that still desperately wants to live. It's just that that piece hasn't quite remembered its own name yet." What Cora couldn't possibly fathom in that instant was that, through those incredibly simple, unadorned syllables, something seismic had just shifted deep inside Mr. Thomas Montgomery's chest, a vital gear that had been rusted shut for 18 agonizing months. The ensuing weeks ushered in a quiet metamorphosis that boasted no official launch date, no ribbon-cutting ceremony, and no grand finale. It was a gradual ripening, much like a field of cotton bursting into white bolls, a process you could only truly appreciate if you took a step backward to view the whole acre. Mr. Thomas had commenced working the rugged earth with a newfound gritty determination. He dramatically widened Cora's meager potato patch, erected a sturdy timber corral for the goats, and meticulously realigned the agonizingly squeaky door with such masterful precision that Cora was left staring in stunned silence for a solid minute, the first time it swung shut without a single shriek. In return, Cora had fallen into the rhythm of setting aside a generous portion of her evening stew for him to consume whenever he dragged himself back from his grueling labor. Not because they had drawn up a contract, simply because it felt entirely, undeniably natural. Yet what the wider Delta society completely failed to witness was the profound foundation being laid beneath this facade of mere survivalist convenience. A profound mutual reverence was taking root, a reverence utterly distinct from any social hierarchy those two had previously navigated, precisely because it sprang from a desolate place where neither party possessed a single ounce of wealth or status to bargain with, save for their own bare humanity. There were no sprawling acres of cash crops being dangled as bait. There were no crinkled freedom papers being leveraged to prove one's worth. There were solely two scarred survivors, who had stumbled to the very precipice of total surrender, and who, thanks to a serendipitous collision on a muddy trail in late September, had somehow ended up taking shelter within the exact same quiet refuge. And then, little Isaac came into the world. It occurred on a violently stormy night in late November, with freezing rain hammering against the newly secured roof shingles and gale-force winds bending the weeping willows nearly in half. Cora had been suffering through the agonizing spasms since mid-afternoon, but had bitten her tongue and remained entirely mute. She possessed a lifelong terror of being a burden, of demanding aid. Her entire existence had been a masterclass in making herself invisible. However, when Mr. Thomas rushed back from securing the livestock in the storm and caught sight of the sheer, white-hot agony etched across her sweating brow, he instantly comprehended the gravity of the hour. He dashed out into the raging tempest, sprinting blindly down the treacherous red mud slope to fetch Auntie Bess, the most ancient and revered midwife in the county, an elderly enslaved woman of immense dignity who had successfully caught over 100 squalling infants across that region, delivering babies born to field hands, babies born to freed folk, and babies born to wealthy white mistresses without a lick of prejudice, simply because the brutal miracle of birth cares nothing for a master's ledger. And Auntie Bess grasped the intricate mysteries of labor with a profound intuition that no expensive, university-trained doctor could ever hope to replicate. That impulsive decision to hurl himself into a freezing deluge simply to summon Auntie Bess would yield consequences that Mr. Thomas would only fully unpack years down the road, when he would peer into his past and pinpoint that frantic sprint as the exact juncture where he formally relinquished his desire to fade away. Auntie Bess arrived drenched but resolute, pushed her way into the drafty cabin, banished Mr. Thomas to the porch, and took complete charge of Cora's agonizing trial with the unshakable, serene authority of a general who has commanded 1,000 battlefields. Mr. Thomas lingered outside, shivering in the relentless rain. He respected the boundary, but crucially he refused to abandon his post. He hunched over a damp crate beneath the awning, straining to decipher the muffled cries echoing through the timber, muttering desperate, breathless prayers for a colored woman who held no legal tie to him, and for a fatherless infant who carried absolutely none of his bloodline. And when little Isaac's piercing, triumphant wail finally sliced through the bitter November gale like a sharpened blade cutting through heavy velvet, hot, unashamed tears tracked freely down Mr. Thomas Montgomery's weathered cheeks, mingling instantly with the icy rainwater dripping from the eaves. Auntie Bess nudged the creaky door open a few minutes later. Her and the young'un are breathing fine. "You can step inside now, farmer," she commanded, choosing that specific noun with a knowing, profound smirk. She didn't address him as Mr. or Master. She called him Farmer. It was a subtle confirmation that, on this sacred night, his past social standing was infinitely less relevant than the raw human labor he had just contributed. Mr. Thomas stepped tentatively over the threshold. Cora lay utterly drained, swimming in sweat, clutching a tiny bundle to her breast. Isaac was minuscule, wrinkled like a raisin, and hollering with a furious lung capacity that vastly overshadowed his tiny frame. He was an absolute miracle. Mr. Thomas stood paralyzed in the doorway for an interval that stretched far longer than the clock could measure. Eventually, he shuffled forward, peering down at the squirming newborn with overwhelming reverence. "With all due respect, Cora," he whispered, his voice cracking slightly under the emotional weight, "this here is a remarkably strong boy." She offered a faint, exhausted smile, keeping her heavy eyelids half shut. "I'm well aware. The little rascal has been giving me absolute hell since the very start." In the exhausting days that followed, Mr. Thomas Montgomery unearthed a dormant capacity within his own soul that he had entirely forgotten he possessed, the profound capacity to be genuinely practically useful to another living creature. He hauled the fresh water. He fetched the morning milk. Whenever Isaac's shrieks shattered the midnight quiet, Thomas would awaken instantly in his lean-to outside, remaining vigilant and alert in the darkness without ever announcing his wakefulness, merely guaranteeing that if a crisis arose, he was already standing guard. Cora was not foolish. She perceived every single act, yet she held her tongue, honoring a delicate unspoken treaty between them that was as fragile as spun glass, terrified that voicing it aloud might shatter the spell before its time. It was exactly during this precarious period that Reverend Josiah made his unwelcome appearance. Reverend Josiah was the fire and brimstone Calvinist preacher of the nearest established parish, a stern 50-year-old figure with a crown of stark white hair, an imposing physical presence, and the unyielding conviction that the rigid racial hierarchy of the South and the divine will of the Almighty were practically identical doctrines. He had been tipped off by a deeply concerned white congregant regarding the highly unorthodox living arrangement developing up on the ridge, a freed black woman cohabitating with a bastard child, while a widely recognized, once respected white planter sleeping in a crude lean-to barely 50 paces from her front door. Such a dynamic in the eyes of the pious community was an absolute outrage. Reverend Josiah had marched up the muddy incline on a crisp Tuesday morning, fully intent on bringing the righteous hammer down upon what he perceived to be a den of filthy sin and social anarchy. He had rapped sharply on the frame of Cora's shack. He had been greeted with quiet respect, offered a rickety chair, and handed a cool tin of creek water. And then he unleashed his sermon, adopting that specific condescending cadence that men of the cloth default to when they are absolutely certain that God himself is riding shotgun on their high horse. "The environment taking root in this location," Reverend Josiah proclaimed, sweeping his cold eyes over the humble room like a tax assessor evaluating a delinquent property, "is highly improper, my child. An unmarried colored woman, a bastard child bearing no legal father, and a gentleman of high birth and status frequenting this squalid dwelling. This arrangement breeds severe concerns that our righteous community possesses every right to interrogate." Cora had absorbed his lecture in absolute silence, a silence heavily laden with unyielding dignity. "Reverend," she stated firmly the moment he paused for breath, "I hold my legal papers of freedom. The child I bore is born free. I tend to my own crops. I maintain the roof over my head, and I happen to have a neighbor who offered his sweat when I was in desperate need, without ever demanding a single copper coin in repayment. I wholly fail to see what righteous concerns your flock needs to interrogate regarding a quiet life that brings absolutely no harm to another breathing soul." Reverend Josiah's jaw dropped, preparing to deliver a furious rebuke. It was at that exact second that Mr. Thomas Montgomery stepped through the threshold, carrying a bucket of foaming goat's milk, froze dead in his tracks upon registering the preacher's presence, recognized the man instantly, and fundamentally refused to yield a single inch of ground. "With all due respect, Reverend Josiah," Thomas stated, his voice a low rumbling thunder of absolute conviction rather than hot-headed fury, "you are currently sitting as a guest in the home of a profoundly honorable woman. All she has ever done is fight to survive, with whatever shreds of dignity this brutal world permitted her. And whatever physical labor I choose to invest upon this ridge is a matter exclusively between my own conscience and the Lord Almighty." Reverend Josiah locked eyes with Mr. Thomas for a tense, protracted eternity. In that pregnant stare, the preacher silently calculated that an invisible line had been crossed, and he was abruptly no longer the most powerful entity in that cramped room. He shifted his harsh glare to Cora, then down to little Isaac, who was slumbering peacefully in a beautifully carved hickory wood cradle that Mr. Thomas had spent weeks whittling by hand. He held his tongue. Finally, he muttered a generic, face-saving platitude about the mysterious and unknowable paths of the Lord, a coward's retreat, and swiftly exited the premises without ever concluding the fiery inquisition he had come to deliver. As the door clicked shut, Cora lifted her eyes to Mr. Thomas. He was staring intently at the floorboards. "I thank you," she whispered. He raised his chin. "You owed me no thanks." "I reckon you needed to say it more than I needed to hear it," she shot back gently. A tiny radiant smile tugged at the corner of her lips. It was the very first occasion he had been blessed with witnessing that genuine, unrestrained expression. And it was precisely within that heartbeat, the razor-thin margin between the self-righteous preacher's retreat and Cora's quiet smile, that Mr. Thomas Montgomery finally understood there was a prize in this world he desired far more than his own erasure. Right here, I urge you to pause the narrative for a brief second and reflect upon just how many profound sagas akin to Cora's have been purposefully erased from the history books. How countless desperate lives were forged in absolute obscurity, lacking a single witness to document their names, their beautiful faces, their grueling struggles, or their unbreakable resilience. If the content on this channel moves your spirit, please consider subscribing right now. Do not hesitate. Do not. Every single subscription acts as a firm vote declaring that these forgotten histories demand to be resurrected, and that the silenced ghosts of our brutal past deserve to resonate loudly in our modern era. Following the preacher's retreat, the atmosphere shifted with a slow, undeniable gravity, akin to a rising tide that creeps up your shins so stealthily you don't realize you're submerged until the water hits your knees. Mr. Thomas's presence inside the cabin ceased to be strictly utilitarian. He began lingering on the front step long after the firewood was chopped, cradling little Isaac against his chest, and the infant had developed the habit of wrapping a tiny fist around Thomas's calloused index finger with that baffling Herculean strength all babies possess, a physical grip that felt akin to a profound moral argument that simply could not be debated. Cora would watch them from the shadowy interior, peering through the glassless window frame, and she recognized a truth in that tableau that she couldn't quite put a name to yet, though she felt its massive significance in her bones. The first actual, friendly visitors from the valley began trickling up the trail a few weeks after Reverend Josiah's humiliating defeat. The juicy gossip had rippled through the county with the rapid-fire, wildly inaccurate velocity unique to isolated farming towns. Yet, one kernel of absolute truth had managed to penetrate the rumor mill, that perched upon the forgotten ridge resided a freedwoman who had boldly stared down the fearsome Calvinist preacher, fiercely defending her sacred rights, and that a wealthy, respected white landowner had firmly planted his boots by her side, rather than cowering behind the church's pulpit. That raw display of defiance alone was enough to forcibly alter the social geometry of the locals. Auntie Bess made the trek once more, this time not hauling boiling water and rags, but arriving as an honored guest, gifting a bolt of soft, bleached cotton for the baby. She wore a knowing grin that suggested she had predicted this outcome all along. A traveling livestock trader passing through the territory actually hiked up the trail specifically to consult with Mr. Thomas regarding a complex land deed dispute. An elderly widow whose own daughter had fled to the bright lights of Memphis began making regular Sunday visits to Cora's stoop, bringing spools of sturdy thread, offering worldly advice, and dispensing the type of pragmatic, no-nonsense sisterhood that women effortlessly provide when they recognize another woman is starved for more than empty chatter. However, what the community remained utterly blind to was the massive internal reconstruction occurring within the soul of Mr. Thomas Montgomery. A miracle was unfolding that he had long ago dismissed as an impossibility. He had actively resumed the mantle of a leader. He had drafted a firm, heavily detailed letter to the overseer down at his grand estate, issuing severe operational directives. He had violently audited the corrupt ledgers the slick Memphis broker had butchered. He had uncovered, with the icy, calculated fury of a warrior, who realizes he let his shield drop entirely too low, the sheer magnitude of the financial thievery, and he had exacted swift, uncompromising legal vengeance. The sprawling Montgomery plantation, which had drifted aimlessly toward bankruptcy for a year and a half, was suddenly violently yanked back onto a profitable course. This wasn't driven by a reignited lust for gold or cotton. It was driven by his desperate hunger to resurrect himself into a man of substance, a man who actually had a stable future to offer. And crucially, he had finally penned a letter to Clara. Drafting that missive to his estranged daughter proved to be the most excruciating ordeal of his entire life, vastly more agonizing than signing the physician's death certificate for his late wife. He wrote candidly about the isolated ridge, he detailed the existence of Cora, and he explained little Isaac. He didn't frame it as a sordid confession, but rather as an honest, unflinching testimony. He wasn't begging on his knees for her absolution. He was simply presenting himself as a flawed father who had finally ceased his cowardly running, choosing brutal transparency with his only living flesh and blood. Clara's reply arrived a grueling 3 weeks later. The courier delivered it on a windy afternoon, and Mr. Thomas absorbed its contents while perched on a stump outside, while Isaac snored softly in the hickory cradle a few feet away, and hope and memory lazily chewed the cud in their enclosure. Clara expressed profound, blistering fury. She declared his cowardly, silent disappearance to be an unforgivable betrayal. She declared it was a cruel torture to abandon her in a sterile boarding school without a whisper of his whereabouts for 18 months. Every stinging accusation was completely justified, and Mr. Thomas swallowed the bitter medicine without a shred of defensiveness. Yet at the very bottom of the final page, Clara had scribbled a single sentence that caused him to hastily fold the parchment and stare blankly out over the rolling delta for an hour. She had written, "Father, if this Miss Cora is the sole reason you finally remembered how to hold a pen, then I demand the opportunity to meet her." Those specific words acted as a key, unlocking a rusted vault buried deep within Mr. Thomas's chest. It blew the hinges off a door he hadn't even realized he was still desperately keeping bolted shut. Later that identical afternoon, as the bleeding sun dipped behind the timberline and the valley floor was bathed in a thick, golden, amber hue, Mr. Thomas approached Cora. She was resting on the porch stairs, peacefully nursing Isaac, a checkered rag draped casually over her shoulder, gazing out over the trees with the serene composure of a survivor who has mastered the art of extracting joy from the quiet spaces between tragedies. He lowered himself into the dirt beside her, pressing his spine against the chinked logs, the goats bleating softly nearby, and he permitted the silence to stretch out comfortably. "Cora," he finally murmured. She waited patiently. "I haven't the faintest clue how to dress this up so it sounds pretty," he confessed, staring straight ahead. "So I'm just going to lay it bare." She continued to listen. "I dragged myself up this cursed hill praying the earth would swallow me whole, and you flatly refused to let it happen. Not by throwing your arms around my knees and begging me to stay, but just by sitting right here, by remaining so damn authentic, so unflinchingly honest, just being exactly who you are, without ever demanding a dime, without judging my cowardice, without pretending this vicious world is anything other than what it is. And that quiet strength was a hell of a lot more than I could muster for my own damned self back then. This boy," he nodded toward Isaac, who had drained his meal and was fighting a losing battle against heavy eyelids. "This little man is the bravest soul I've ever crossed paths with, because he showed up when the entire universe was rigged against his survival, and he dug his heels in and he grew anyway. Exactly like his mama." Cora slowly turned her head to look at him. Her features didn't register shock. It was a look of profound validation, the look of a woman who had secretly prayed to hear those exact words, but had fiercely forbidden herself from expecting them, lest the disappointment break her completely. "Are you planning on staying?" she asked, wielding that trademark piercing directness of hers, the bluntness of a woman who had long ago run out of patience for poetic dancing. "I intend to stay permanently," he answered softly, "if you'll have me." "And what exactly does staying mean, Mr. Thomas?" He inhaled a massive, steadying breath. "It means I want to ensure Isaac grows up with a father's name. It means I want to provide you with a partner who doesn't vanish like smoke. It means I want to try and fix whatever broken pieces of my life can still be salvaged." Cora retreated into a pensive silence, a sacred gap that Mr. Thomas honored without daring to utter a peep. Finally, she spoke. "You're a smart man. You know exactly the firestorm this will ignite. Folks are going to talk loud and ugly. There's folks who will cross the street to spit at our shadows. I'm fully aware," he replied steadily. "And knowing all that poison, you still want this? Knowing all that poison, I want it more." She studied the lines around his eyes for a long, searching moment. Then she turned her gaze back out toward the amber-soaked canopy. "With all due respect, Mr. Thomas Montgomery," she drawled, flashing that minuscule, authentic smile he had come to adore, "you took your sweet time getting here." A bark of laughter erupted from his chest. It was the absolute first time he had laughed genuinely from his belly in over a year and a half. The noise surprised even him. It was booming, unburdened, like a massive dam had finally cracked open and the pressure was roaring free. The goats snapped their heads up at the sudden commotion, fixing him with that uniquely baffled stare livestock reserve for inexplicable human behavior. Isaac peeled open a single eye, deemed the noise non-threatening, and promptly passed back out. Yet, neither adult fully grasped that the most brutal social battle was still looming on the horizon. Mr. Thomas Montgomery was a man born to wealth, commanding acres of land, a respected family crest, and significant political clout in the Mississippi Delta. Cora was a formerly enslaved woman, possessing nothing but a flimsy manumission paper stuffed in her apron pocket. Attempting to legally bind such a union in a courthouse in the Deep South during the 1850s was an act of sheer madness that required a magistrate's stamp, community tolerance, and navigating a labyrinth of deeply ingrained racial laws that Reverend Josiah upheld with terrifying fanatical zeal. And Reverend Josiah had already been humiliated once. Men of his ilk do not forget a bruised ego. Salvation materialized from an incredibly unlikely source. A thick parcel arrived from Thomas's high-priced attorney up in Memphis, revealing that, provided certain obscure legal loopholes were exploited and the paperwork meticulously drafted, there existed a narrow legal precedent for common law acknowledgement, provided Thomas registered his intent to bequeath property. Precedent existed purely because other powerful, wealthy white men in the South had quietly forced the issue behind closed doors, and the turbulent America of the late 1850s, teetering dangerously on the precipice of a massive, bloody reckoning that everyone felt in their bones but dared not speak of aloud, was reluctantly beginning to fracture in ways previously deemed utterly impossible. Mr. Thomas took this stack of legal armor directly to Reverend Josiah's front door. He rode down to the parish house, hammered a heavy fist against the oak door, and was ushered inside with the icy, hostile formality reserved for a dreaded tax collector. He slapped the dense legal briefs directly onto the preacher's desk with the serene, terrifying calm of a man who has meticulously plotted his war strategy. Reverend Josiah scanned the dense legal jargon in stone-cold silence. He lifted his eyes to glare at Thomas. He dropped his gaze back to the parchment, and then he spat out, armed with that customary self-righteous stubbornness, that the union remained a wicked abomination in the eyes of the Lord, and his church would never, ever sanction a marriage that spat in the face of God's natural racial hierarchy. Mr. Thomas absorbed the preacher's venom without flinching. Then he leaned forward, his voice dropping an octave, radiating a quiet, lethal certainty. "With all due respect, Reverend, I don't give a damn if you bless it or if you damn it. I am taking Cora as my wife, regardless of your theology. The only choice you're making today is whether this entire county remembers you as a man who stood with love or a coward who stood in the way of it." Reverend Josiah remained paralyzed, entirely speechless, for a painfully long minute. The sequence of events that unfolded next represents the absolute emotional zenith of this tale, and I urge you to visualize it slowly, honoring every ounce of dignity the moment demands. It was a glorious Saturday morning in February of 1856, nearly a full half-year since that initial dawn when Mr. Thomas had dragged his boots up the trail with 2 stubborn goats. The sun had burst over the horizon early, radiating a crisp, crystalline light, the specific kind of pristine weather that only graces the Delta on its absolute finest days. The tiny, fiercely independent community of outcasts, freedmen, and sympathetic farmers scattered across the hills had trudged up the rutted clay path dressing in their Sunday best, acutely aware they were about to witness history. Auntie Bess arrived first, sporting a vibrant, newly dyed head wrap, her ancient eyes glistening with unshed tears before a single word had even been spoken. The cattle trader arrived holding his wife's hand. The elderly widow who had befriended Cora showed up clutching a magnificent wild bouquet of dogwood blossoms and honeysuckle, still dripping with the morning's chill dew. Dozens of others materialized, folks Cora had never formally met, yet who had caught wind of the saga and determined in their hearts that such a monumental victory demanded a massive crowd of witnesses. Cora emerged from the dirt-chinked cabin exactly at 10 o'clock. She was adorned in a brilliant white cotton gown that Auntie Bess had hoarded in a cedar chest for over a decade, preserving it for a miraculous occasion she wasn't sure she would live to see, and which she had surrendered to Cora without a word of negotiation, instinctively knowing this was the prophecy fulfilled. Her feet remained entirely bare, but the red clay was baked dry, warm and sturdy beneath her soles, and she had consciously elected that she would rather feel the solid earth that grounded her than hide her roots inside leather boots. Isaac was nestled securely in Auntie Bess's sturdy arms, swaddled in fresh, bleached linen, snoozing away with the blissful ignorance unique to infants who are completely oblivious to the monumental historical gravity of the era they occupy. Mr. Thomas Montgomery stood tall and rigid before a modest makeshift altar they had fashioned beneath the sprawling branches of a massive, ancient willow tree, wearing a freshly pressed linen suit and an expression that lacked the arrogance of a wealthy master, radiating instead the profound humility of a wanderer who had finally stumbled upon his true north after years of agonizing misdirection. As Cora glided toward him, his eyes locked onto hers, eyes that had witnessed horrific tragedy, yet were currently beholding a miraculous salvation they hadn't even realized they were starving for. And astonishingly, Reverend Josiah had made an appearance. He had crested the hill entirely unannounced, a mere 5 minutes before the vows commenced, and had taken his solemn position in front of the weeping willow, wearing a profoundly inscrutable mask, neither projecting joyful endorsement nor furious condemnation, but rather the resigned demeanor of a stubborn man who had wrestled with his conscience late into the night, and begrudgingly admitted that there were forces of human devotion operating on this ridge vastly more powerful than the rigid social order he preached. The scriptures Reverend Josiah recited during that brief service were the exact same traditional verses he regurgitated at every wealthy white planter's lavish wedding down in the valley. Yet there was an unmistakable tremor in his pauses, a profound softness in the way his gaze drifted over to little Isaac, slumbering in Auntie Bessie's embrace between the psalms, which subtly telegraphed that he comprehended, even if his pride forbade him from screaming it aloud, that this was infinitely more than a simple exchange of rings. It was a roaring declaration of war against despair. It was the triumph of two utterly broken souls who had plummeted to the absolute rock bottom of human suffering, and rather than letting the dark waters drown them, had boldly chosen to swim toward the surface holding hands. The exact second Mr. Thomas layered his massive blistered hand over Cora's, his palm roughened by the plough, resting atop her slender fingers, scarred by months of lugging heavy oak water pails through the mud, while heavy with child, an electric shockwave rippled through the assembled congregation beneath the willow, a sensation that transcended mere sentimentality. It was the shock of profound recognition, the overwhelming collective gasp that humans emit when they are actively watching a legendary, undeniable truth manifest right before their very eyes, fully aware they are witnessing a miracle, even if they lack the precise vocabulary to articulate the phenomenon to their grandchildren later. The moment Reverend Josiah formally pronounced the union sealed, Auntie Bess broke down into violent, racking sobs. It wasn't a polite, stifled sniffle. It was a torrential, agonizing, joyous wail, with heavy tears flooding her deeply lined ancient face, without a single shred of embarrassment, weeping with the immense dignity of an elder who had survived enough brutality to recognize that pure, unadulterated moments of victory like this were painfully scarce, and demanded to be celebrated with every ounce of one's soul. And that raw emotional release infected the small crowd like wildfire, until there was hardly a dry eye left standing on that red clay slope on that radiant Saturday in February. Mr. Thomas kissed his bride with the same quiet, staggering gentleness that had defined his every action since the morning he first crested the hill. And Cora reached up, resting her palm softly against his cheek for a fleeting second, a minuscule, incredibly subtle gesture that was largely invisible to the folk standing in the back rows, yet was so heavily saturated with raw intention and deep spiritual recognition that those standing close enough to witness it understood its massive weight instantly. That simple touch declared, "I see the real you, not the wealthy master, not the broken widower, not the social pariah. I see you." The ensuing months blurred together into a season of tranquil healing, the variety of slow-burn peace that a person only truly acknowledges when they look back over their shoulder years later. Isaac grew robust, his vision sharpened, tracking the weathered face of the giant man who hoisted him into the air every single morning, pulling ridiculous faces until he successfully extracted that glorious first giggle of the day, after which the boy simply refused to stop laughing. Those peals of laughter, the uniquely intoxicating hiccuping joy of a thriving infant that floods a wooden cabin with a light so bright it defies description, caused Mr. Thomas Montgomery to weep in a manner he hadn't managed to achieve even at Miss Eleanor's gravesite. These were not tears born of agonizing loss. They sprouted from an overwhelming emotion that lacked a formal title, but operated as the absolute polar opposite of crippling loneliness. Cora's physical strength returned in full force. Her resilient body healed entirely, her inner courage cementing itself upon a radically new foundation, a bedrock vastly superior to any she had known before, because this foundation was poured from the concrete of free will and choice, rather than the desperate panic of mere survival. She threw herself into cultivating the expanded garden with a fierce, joyful purpose, no longer just desperately fighting off starvation, but driven by the profound realization that she and her husband were laying down roots for an empire of their own that would outlast them. The humble plot of land began to absolutely flourish beneath their synchronized, calloused hands. What had formerly been a pathetic, rotting hovel transformed into a formidable, respectable homestead, boasting solid, weatherproof walls, a masterfully shingled roof that deflected the worst storms, and a sprawling vegetable patch overflowing with collard greens, okra, and ripe tomatoes. And deep in the evening, after Isaac had succumbed to sleep and the wild delta had lowered its volume to that familiar, hypnotic chorus of cicadas and rustling leaves, they would speak of the years to come, with the euphoric liberty granted only to those who no longer have a single skeleton left to hide. I intend for Isaac to master his letters, Cora whispered fiercely one starry night. I demand he receives the education I was brutally denied. He shall have it, Mr. Thomas confirmed instantly, without a millisecond of hesitation. I'll hire a private tutor from Memphis. And if no tutor dares ride up this ridge, I'll enroll him in the finest academy up north, right alongside Clara. Clara? Cora repeated the name softly, letting the syllables roll over her tongue. When exactly is she arriving? In the spring, mid-March, he answered, assuming you feel ready to welcome her. Cora turned her head to look him dead in the eye. I've been ready for that girl since long before you even worked up the nerve to ask. Clara rolled up the ridge in March, 17 years of age, wearing the hardened, guarded expression of a young woman acutely aware. She was marching into a massive emotional crucible. She arrived in a hired buggy, clutching a single leather valise, her sharp eyes scanning the property with the exact same calculating, razor-sharp intellect she had inherited directly from her father. She scrutinized the sturdy, reinforced timber cabin. She evaluated the thriving, meticulously weeded garden. She observed the two fat goats, Hope and Memory, happily gnawing on weeds inside the impressive wooden corral her father had erected. And finally her gaze locked onto Cora, who stood tall and proud on the front porch, bouncing Isaac on her hip. A tense, breathless fraction of a second passed in silent, mutual appraisal, two formidable women sizing up the other's spirit with the kind of brutal transparency that renders polite social pleasantries utterly useless. And then Clara closed the distance, marching directly up the wooden steps, and firmly extended her open arms toward Isaac. "May I hold my brother?" she asked. "You may," Cora replied smoothly, and Clara awkwardly but fiercely accepted the heavy infant into her embrace, handling him with the terrified caution of a girl who had never touched a baby in her life, but was aggressively determined not to drop this one. When Mr. Thomas Montgomery pushed open the front door and absorbed the unbelievable tableau playing out on his porch, he froze, as if struck by lightning. His estranged daughter Clara, awkwardly rocking little Isaac, staring down into the colored boy's face with a complex cocktail of utter bewilderment and genuine unforced tenderness. And Cora, standing just a breath away, observing the awkward exchange with that signature, minuscule smirk that served as her highest badge of approval. He remained rooted to the doorframe, utterly paralyzed by a slice of time he desperately wished he could freeze in amber forever. The turbulent decades that rolled over the South next served as the ultimate fiery crucible, proving beyond a shadow of a doubt that empires built upon raw, ugly truths can weather hurricanes that absolutely annihilate empires constructed upon polite, convenient lies. They endured bountiful harvests, and they endured seasons of absolute hell. Incredible tension blanketed the land when the devastating Civil War finally ended in 1865, and emancipation shattered the old world order, a massive paradigm shift that left nearly every white planter in the Delta paralyzed with rage and confusion, not because Mr. Thomas opposed the freedom of the slaves, he had already freed his own heart from that evil, but because massive societal upheaval unleashes chaotic physical realities that demand backbreaking labor to fix, rather than flowery political speeches. Through every agonizing crisis, Cora served as the unshakable pragmatic anchor of the estate. It was Cora who fiercely advocated to immediately pivot and offer highly competitive, honest cash wages to the newly emancipated men and women wandering away from the neighboring bankrupt plantations, whose former masters had cowardly fled to the city in ruins. It was Cora who sat at the ledger table, negotiating labor contracts with the unyielding, razor-sharp grit of a woman who had never been afforded the luxury of dancing around a subject. And it was Cora who tightly gripped Isaac's hand on the boy's 10th birthday when he successfully gripped a fountain pen and spelled out his full legal name for the very first time, scrawling it across a fresh sheet of paper that was promptly folded and tucked into the exact same spot inside her bodice, where those old, worthless emancipation papers had hidden for so long, until the new parchment became frayed from being proudly unfolded and displayed over and over again. Isaac Montgomery. The surname was Cora's explicit decree, and Mr. Thomas hadn't dared utter a syllable of protest, because he profoundly understood the seismic weight of that title. It wasn't merely ink smeared on paper, it was a roar into the heavens, a legal, unbreakable declaration that this young black boy, born on a freezing night during a raging storm inside a crumbling dirt shack, absolutely belonged to a formidable legacy. He possessed a history, he possessed a rightful name, he possessed a destiny. The official news of emancipation swept across the South with the surreal, chaotic suddenness typical of moments that forever alter the axis of the earth. The thunderous decree of freedom had traveled up the Mississippi River, passed from ecstatic whisper to jubilant shout, rippling from one ruined plantation to the next, until it finally summited the ridge where Cora and Mr. Thomas had stubbornly carved out their paradise. Cora absorbed the world-shaking news while perched on a rocking chair on the porch, the warm spring sun baking the red clay, watching a 10-year-old Isaac chase a hound through the tomato vines while the elderly goats chewed happily near the fence. She sank into a profound, suffocating silence for an eternity, staring down at the brittle, yellowed manumission document she had slowly retrieved from her dress. The paper was disintegrating, the sharp creases worn almost totally transparent by years of anxious, terrified handling. She stared holes through that flimsy scrap of parchment that had served as her sole, pathetic armor against a viciously cruel universe, her only legal proof that her lungs were permitted to draw free air, and her mind drifted to the millions of women who had never possessed such a document. She thought of the millions of enslaved mothers and daughters who were waking up on this glorious morning, utterly devoid of any paperwork, who would now, for the first time in American history, never have to beg a master for their humanity again. She thought of the countless ancestors who had bled and died possessing no papers whatsoever, carrying the burning flame of their intrinsic freedom locked securely within the vaults of their own chests, invisible to the whip, yet completely indestructible. She delicately folded the crumbling document for the final time. She raised her chin, casting her gaze over the rolling expanse of the delta, a landscape she now recognized in all its violent moods. The bleeding amber of dusk, the dreary grey of dawn, the violent bruised purple of tornado season, and the crystal-clear sapphire skies of late February. She looked at her strong, intelligent son, at the aging livestock, at the massive, sprawling homestead they had erected from the mud, log by heavy log. She was sobbing, not from sorrow, from a colossal, overwhelming tidal wave of emotion that defied the English dictionary, an explosive cocktail consisting of boundless gratitude, fiery rage, staggering relief, agonizing grief for the dead, and blinding hope, all swirling together into a singular, crushing force that poured out of her eyes without begging permission. Mr. Thomas pushed open the screen door, stepped out onto the boards, and lowered himself into the chair beside her. He didn't say a damn word. He simply reached out and enveloped her trembling hand inside his massive grip. And they remained anchored there, shoulders touching, staring out into the identical horizon, as the bruised and bleeding South slowly began to digest the terrifying, beautiful reality that the old world had finally burned to the ground. This epic saga didn't conclude with emancipation. In truth, that was merely the closing of the first act, because Isaac was bound to grow into a formidable man, and there were destined to be fresh conflicts, fresh battles, and agonizingly slow reconstructions. Clara would return to that hallowed ridge years down the line, a husband in tow, and her pale children would sprint wildly through the cotton rows and the vegetable patches alongside Isaac's dark-skinned children, chasing the descendants of hope and memory. Mr. Thomas Montgomery would slowly turn grey and frail beside his beloved Cora, radiating that incredibly specific, unshakable tranquility reserved exclusively for sailors who have navigated their vessel through the absolute worst of the hurricane and reached the distant shore without ever having surrendered their moral compass to the devil. And Cora, the woman who had dragged her battered spirit up that hill carrying nothing but a bundle of rags, a fatherless child growing in her womb and a decaying slip of legal parchment over her heart, would gracefully age into an elder matriarch, remaining exactly who she had been from the very first breath, the one unbreakable force that nobody on earth possessed the power to conquer. Not the cowardly young Master Charles who fled to the city, not the fanatical Reverend Josiah with his hateful theology, and certainly not the suffocating claws of grief that had almost dragged Mr. Thomas to an early grave. She would age with absolute, magnificent authenticity, and roaming somewhere upon that high ground, hope and memory, the pair of stubborn goats that had marched up the trail beside a shattered man on that fateful September morning in 1855, had lived out their natural days, leaving behind a lineage of offspring that continued to graze within the exact same boundaries, living monuments to the precise hour when the axis of the universe tilted, when a broken man carrying nothing but a hoe trudged up a muddy incline, and a pregnant, abandoned woman stared right through his shattered exterior and recognized not the ruin he currently was, but the titan he could still become. Destiny rarely announces its grandest arrivals with trumpet fanfares. It shows up disguised as rusty hoes and bleating goats. It manifests as muddy red trails on sweltering September mornings. It disguises itself as exhausted, pregnant women resting on stones, and hollowed-out men who simply refuse to stop putting one foot in front of the other. It hands you the terrifying, beautiful opportunity to resurrect your entire existence, standing on the exact same patch of dirt, utilizing the exact same scarred hands, but fueled by a radically different purpose. And if you possess the sheer audacity to confess that your soul is shattered, if you harbor enough bravery to hit the brakes when another human being is bleeding, even when you are bleeding out yourself, if you are capable of gazing at the broken soul standing right in front of you, drowning under the weight they carry, and recognizing not a burden to be avoided, but a magnificent masterpiece mid-restoration, then perhaps you will realize that the suffocating, terrifying silence of the valley, the silence that felt exactly like a tomb, was merely the deep breath the orchestra takes right before the symphony erupts. It was merely the quiet void before your actual, authentic life was finally permitted to begin. If this sweeping narrative has managed to pluck a chord deep within your spirit, I leave you with one humble request. Share this tale with a soul out there who desperately needs to hear that rising from the ashes is always possible. And if you have not yet joined our growing family of listeners who firmly believe that the silenced voices of our brutal past demand a microphone, hit that subscribe button right now. Every single history we breathe life into on here is a blazing torch held high against the suffocating darkness of amnesia. Until we meet again.